Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly uncomfortable journey back to the very origins of romantic relationships, to the bustling, sun-drenched city-states of ancient Greece, particularly Athens, famed for its philosophers, its democracy, and its vibrant public life. But forget the modern notions of dating apps, casual encounters, or even choosing your own partner. You're about to discover what dating was really like in ancient Greece. A grim reality where your romantic future was meticulously determined by family, politics, and social status, leaving virtually no room for personal choice or true affection. This wasn't a journey of self-discovery. It was a rigidly controlled social transaction that often began in childhood and continued into a deeply unequal marriage, frankly. You probably wouldn't survive the initial matchmaking without longing for a simpler, less constrained, and far less public life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in Athens, around the 5th or 4th century BCE, the height of its classical era. The Parthenon gleams on the Acropolis, the Agora hums with activity, and the air is thick with the scent of olive oil, spices, and the clamor of a thriving city. You are a young Athenian, perhaps a male citizen from a respectable family, or a female born into a citizen household. And your life, especially your romantic future, is already inextricably linked to the complex, unyielding social fabric of your polis city-state. Your journey begins not with a personal choice, but with a predetermined, rigidly controlled destiny. This is childhood's end, where your romantic future is precisely arranged by family and politics, not by your own budding affections from a very young age. The concept of dating as we understand it today, a period of casual romantic exploration, getting to know someone personally, or falling in love before marriage, simply did not exist in ancient Greece, particularly in conservative Athens. The entire process of finding a partner was almost exclusively about marriage, and marriage itself was primarily a social, economic, and political arrangement, not a romantic union based on mutual affection. Your feelings, your personal compatibility, your dreams of a loving spouse, all were largely irrelevant in the face of family strategy and civic duty. It truly sucked to have your heart be a family asset. For you, a young Athenian girl, your future as a wife was mapped out from the moment of your birth. Your upbringing would be meticulously designed to prepare you for this singular role. You would be largely confined to the household oikos, learning domestic skills from your mother, overseeing slaves, managing finances, and raising children. Your interactions with the men outside your immediate family would be severely limited and strictly chaperoned. Your courtship would involve no romantic outings, no whispered conversations under the moonlight, no opportunities to truly know your future husband. Your family would seek a suitable match for you based on social standing, wealth, and political connections, not your personal happiness. The age of marriage for girls was incredibly young, often between 14 and 18 years old, sometimes even younger. This meant your entire life and your body was prepared for a union that you had no say in and barely understood. Imagine being a literal child, suddenly married off to a stranger, your life consumed by adult responsibilities you barely comprehended. It truly sucked to be married off before you even knew what love was. For you, a young Athenian male citizen, your path was equally predetermined, though with more freedom of movement, your primary focus in youth would be on education, military training, and civic participation in the public sphere, the agora, the assembly, the gymnasium. Your marriage, too, would be arranged by your father or other male guardian and male relatives. They would seek a wife for you based on her family's social standing. Her dowry, her financial contribution to the marriage, which was managed by her male guardian, and the potential for a favorable political alliance between the two families. Your personal preference, while perhaps considered to a minor degree if you were older and very wealthy, was ultimately secondary to family strategy and the production of legitimate heirs to carry on your lineage. You might not even meet your future wife until very close to the wedding ceremony. Imagine having your entire romantic future decided by a committee of old men. It truly sucked to have your romantic destiny be a business deal. The purpose of marriage in ancient Greece was overwhelmingly procreation technopoeia. Technopoeia, particularly the production of legitimate male heirs to carry on the family name oikos, property, and ancestral cult. It was about civic duty, ensuring a new generation of citizens for the polis. Emotional companionship and romantic love were considered secondary, or even irrelevant, to this primary function. Indeed, the ancient Greeks often distinguished between different forms of love, eros, passionate, sexual desire, philia, friendship, affection, and agape, unconditional love. Marriage was often seen as primarily philia, a pragmatic partnership rather than eros. This functional view of marriage starkly contrasted with any modern romantic notions. The age disparity in marriages was also common and significant. Men typically married much later than women, often in their late 20s or 30s, after they had completed their military service, established their careers, and were economically self-sufficient. This meant a substantial age gap between husband and wife, often 10 to 20 years or more. Imagine a sophisticated, worldly man in his 30s marrying a girl barely out of childhood. This difference in age, experience, and maturity further contributed to the unequal nature of the relationship, minimizing any chance of a genuine, emotionally intimate partnership. The concept of a dowry, proix. Proa was central to ancient Greek marriage for the bride's family, providing a dowry, typically in money, goods, or land, was essential to secure a good match for their daughter and to demonstrate their financial standing. For the groom's family, the dowry was a crucial financial asset that contributed to the household's wealth, although the bride herself usually retained nominal ownership, managed by her husband. The size and quality of the dowry could directly influence a girl's marriage prospects, effectively turning her into a commodity in a marriage market. Imagine your entire worth being quantified by a sum of money or property. It truly sucked to be a human asset. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek marriages were universally unhappy or devoid of affection. While romance was not the primary basis and the terms were deeply unequal, some couples undoubtedly developed affection and companionship over time. Particularly after children were born, however, the foundational structure of these marriages arranged for practical reasons, with significant age gaps and gender segregation, made genuine emotional intimacy a challenging achievement rather than a given expectation. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts, wajiwa concerning marriage, dowry, divorce, philosophical discussions, Xenophon's Oeconomicus on household management, and social commentaries by Lysias on Athenian women's lives to understand the precise customs, expectations, and emotional realities of ancient Greek marriages. often finding a far more complex picture than simplistic notions of either universal misery or romantic partnership. Furthermore, the very lack of public interaction between unmarried men and women meant that any opportunity for mutual attraction or personal connection before marriage was virtually non-existent. Young men would spend their time in the agora, the gymnasium, or at symposia drinking parties, where women were typically excluded. Young women were confined to their homes. This extreme social segregation ensured that romantic relationships, as we know them, simply couldn't develop organically in the way they do today, further emphasizing the arranged nature of marriage, the psychological toll of living in a society where your romantic destiny was utterly predetermined, where your personal feelings were deemed irrelevant, and where marriage was a cold, pragmatic transaction, would be immense. You would grow up knowing your future was not your own, perhaps longing for a connection that society forbade, the constant pressure to conform to societal expectations, to accept an arranged marriage to a stranger, and to fulfill your duty of procreation would erode your spirit, leaving you with a profound sense of resignation and a lack of personal agency in the most intimate aspects of your life. Your earliest lessons were about duty, not desire. The process of finding a partner, therefore, was not a journey of personal discovery, but a carefully controlled social negotiation. Your family's honor, your economic stability, and your city-state's future all hinged on the correct marriage, making every match a high-stakes decision, devoid of personal passion. So, your journey into ancient Greek dating began with childhood's end, where your romantic future was meticulously determined by family and politics from a young age. This profound lack of personal choice, coupled with the rigid social norms that dictated marriage as a pragmatic transaction for procreation and alliance, was the first, and perhaps most foundational, aspect of what dating was really like in ancient Greece. Having seen your romantic future meticulously arranged from birth, your daily life as an Athenian woman, if citizen-born, was then shaped by a profound and pervasive system of gender segregation. Forget bustling public squares or vibrant social mixing. Your world was largely confined by women's walls, dictating political silence and domestic confinement, making dating as you know it profoundly sucked. Imagine your upbringing. From your earliest childhood, your life was distinct from that of your brothers. While boys were sent to schools, gymnasia, and the public spaces of the agora, your education was largely confined to the household oikos. This wasn't just your physical home. It was your entire world, encompassing the dwelling, its inhabitants, family members, slaves, and its intricate management. Your days would be meticulously filled with domestic duties, overseeing the household slaves, managing food supplies, spinning wool, weaving cloth, making clothes, and, most crucially, raising children. Your entire existence was a ceaseless cycle of practical, essential, but largely unacknowledged labor within the confines of your home, preparing you for your future role as a wife and mother. It truly sucked to have your entire life revolve around the house. The physical boundaries of your life were often just as restrictive as the social ones. Wealthy citizen women were largely confined to the gynaeconitis gyneconides, the women's quarters of the house. This was typically located at the back of the house, on the upper floor, or in a secluded area, purposefully set apart from the andron, the male reception rooms where your husband would entertain his male guests. While not a literal prison, venturing outside these quarters without a chaperone, or without a specific, permissible purpose like attending a religious festival or a funeral, was often frowned upon and could severely damage your reputation. Your public appearances were minimal, limited to solemn religious ceremonies, specific family events like weddings or funerals, always under strict supervision, emphasizing your separation from public life. Imagine hearing the lively debates of the agora from your secluded garden, knowing you could never participate. It truly sucked to live in a gilded cage, hearing freedom just outside. Your interactions with men outside your immediate family were severely limited and strictly chaperoned. Unmarried men and women did not date or socialize freely. Any interaction between an unmarried girl and a man who was not a close relative would be viewed with suspicion and could compromise her honor, making her unsuitable for marriage. Even after marriage, your husband would primarily socialize with other men in public spaces or at symposia, male drinking parties, where women were typically excluded unless they were hetairai, who we will discuss later. Your husband's male friends would rarely, if ever, enter your private quarters, further isolating you. This pervasive gender segregation ensured that romantic relationships, as we understand them, simply couldn't develop organically before marriage. Education for citizen women was highly circumscribed, focused almost entirely on domestic skills, household management, and perhaps basic literacy to manage accounts or read religious texts, unlike boys who attended public schools and received training in rhetoric, philosophy, and public speaking skills vital for civic participation. These intellectual pursuits were deemed unnecessary or even dangerous. For women, your intellectual life, if any, was a private pursuit, rarely engaged in publicly or with male peers, ensuring your knowledge was tailored solely for your domestic role. Your mental world, while perhaps rich, was largely hidden from the public eye. This strict segregation was not viewed as oppressive by many ancient Athenians. It was considered a natural and necessary part of social order and morality. A virtuous woman's reputation was paramount, inextricably linked to her modesty and her confinement to the household. Her role was to manage the oikos efficiently, to produce legitimate heirs for the citizen body, and to maintain her family's honor through strict adherence to social norms. Any public visibility or independent action was viewed with suspicion and could lead to accusations of impropriety, ruining her reputation and making her an outcast. For foreign women medics, their situation was even more precarious. While some might engage in professions outside the home like working in markets, selling goods, or working as wet nurses or courtesans, they too had no political rights, and their social status was even lower than citizen women. They were often vulnerable to exploitation and harassment without the same protections of citizen male relatives or the limited legal standing that citizen women possessed. Their engagement in public life was often driven by economic necessity, not by choice or social acceptance, and they remained perpetual outsiders. With no voice in the democracy, the philosophical and social attitudes prevalent in Athens further reinforced this confinement. Prominent male Athenians, even figures like Pericles, as quoted by Thucydides, "The greatest glory for a woman is to be least spoken of among men, either for good or for evil," believed that a woman's virtue lay in her quiet domesticity and her unobtrusive nature. Her worth was primarily tied to her ability to produce legitimate male heirs and to manage the household efficiently. This patriarchal worldview permeated every aspect of Athenian society, shaping expectations and limiting opportunities for women from birth to death. The psychological toll of living in a society that loudly proclaimed freedom and equality for its male citizens, while systematically denying you any part in it, would be immense. You would constantly be reminded of your inferior status, your lack of agency, and your inability to shape your own political or social destiny. Your grievances, your opinions, your very voice were considered irrelevant in the public sphere. This silent, pervasive exclusion, this constant suppression of your individuality, was a profound and constant source of misery, making the celebrated Athenian democracy a truly terrible system for you. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek women lived in extreme seclusion, resembling Purda in some other cultures. In reality, while Athenian citizen women, particularly of the elite, did experience significant confinement, women in other Greek city-states like Sparta, where women had more physical freedom, participated in public athletic training, and owned land. As explored in the episode, the brutal upbringing and training of a Spartan child, or in lower social classes who might work in markets or contribute to family businesses, might have had more direct engagement with public life due to economic necessity. However, the fundamental exclusion from political power and official public discourse was a consistent feature across most Greek democracies. Even if the degree of physical confinement varied, historians still meticulously study Athenian legal texts, e.g., concerning marriage, dowry, and inheritance. Philosophical discussions, or G. Xenophon's Oeconomicus on household management, and social commentaries, e.g., by Lysias, on Athenian women's lives and legal status to understand the precise daily lives and restrictions faced by Athenian women, confirming their profound domestic confinement and political silence. Furthermore, the very architecture of Athenian homes often reflected this gender segregation. The gynaeconitis was a physical manifestation of women's separate sphere, often less accessible to visitors and designed for privacy relative to the male andron. This architectural design reinforced social norms, ensuring that even within the home, the separation of genders was maintained, further limiting a woman's interaction with the outside world and male visitors. The constant pressure to maintain your honor, to avoid any public scandal or perceived impropriety, added another layer of psychological burden. A woman's reputation was paramount, and any hint of public visibility or independent action could ruin her chances of a good marriage if unmarried or bring shame upon her husband and family. This constant need for modesty and discretion, often at the expense of personal expression, contributed to a life lived under perpetual scrutiny. However subtle, the primary avenue for women's public participation was religious festivals and cults. Women played crucial roles in various religious ceremonies, processions, and rites dedicated to goddesses like Athena, Demeter, or Artemis. These offered opportunities for women to leave the home, interact with other women, and participate in communal life, albeit in a strictly religious context and often under specific rules. However, even these important roles did not translate into political power or broader social autonomy. They were carefully circumscribed activities, designed to maintain social order. So, your daily life in ancient Greek democracy as an Athenian woman was profoundly shaped by gender segregation and women's walls. You were largely confined to the household. Your role focused on domestic duties, managing slaves, and raising children. With no voice in the public sphere, no legal autonomy, and limited education beyond domestic skills, this pervasive exclusion, ensuring your separation from public life and your political silence, was a defining yet profoundly awful aspect of Greek democracy, and a primary reason why dating, as you might envision it, simply didn't exist for you. Even as you, the Athenian woman, were confined by the walls of your oikos and your voice silenced in the political sphere. The male citizens of ancient Greece enjoyed a remarkably vibrant and public existence, filled with social bonds and intellectual pursuits that largely excluded women. Forget equal footing or shared experiences. The male gaze dominated public life. making dating as you know it. Profoundly sucked. Imagine a typical day in Athens as your confined existence revolved around the household. The male citizens, your male relatives, were engaging in a bustling, dynamic world outside your domestic walls. Their lives were meticulously crafted around public participation, social interaction, and intellectual discourse. This created a profound gender segregation where the most celebrated aspects of Athenian life were almost entirely male-centric. It truly sucked to be relegated to the shadows while half the city thrived publicly. The Agora, the central marketplace and civic center, was the heart of male public life. Here, men would gather from dawn till dusk to conduct business, engage in political debates, listen to philosophical discussions, and simply socialize. Imagine the vibrant clamor merchants hawking their wares, philosophers expounding their theories, citizens debating laws, and friends meeting to exchange gossip. This was a dynamic, lively space where reputation was forged and influence was wielded. You, as a respectable woman, would rarely, if ever, set foot in the agora, or only briefly, heavily chaperoned, and for specific purposes like buying goods, never for leisure or social interaction. Your male counterparts thrived in this public forum, while you remained confined to the private sphere. Beyond the agora, the gymnasion, and palestra were central to male social and physical life. These were public training grounds where men and boys exercised, wrestled, boxed, and engaged in athletic contests, often in the nude, as explored in Why the Ancient Olympic Games Were a Brutal, Bloody Mess. Chapter 2, they were also important social centers, where men would gather to converse, philosophize, and build physical and social bonds. Imagine the sights and sounds, the grunts of exertion, the slap of skin, the shouts of encouragement, and the lively discussions among men, all in an environment from which women were explicitly excluded. This celebrated display of male physicality and camaraderie further reinforced the gender divide. Denying women access to vital social and networking spaces, it truly sucked to be excluded from athletic and social hubs. Symbosion, or male drinking parties, were another crucial component of male social life, and a primary setting for male bonding and intellectual exchange. These were private gatherings, hosted in the andron male reception room of a house, where men would recline, drink wine often diluted, eat, tell stories, listen to music, and engage in philosophical, political, or poetic discussions. Respectable women, even wives, were generally excluded from these gatherings. The only women present might be hetairai courtesans, who we will discuss in Chapter 6, or female musicians, dancers. These symposia were where intellectual reputations were made, political alliances forged, and social hierarchies subtly reinforced. You, as a respectable wife, would be confined to your gyneconitis, while your husband engaged in lively, uninhibited conversations and built crucial social bonds that were vital for his public life. It truly sucked to have your husband's intellectual and social life be outside your home. The concept of male bonds and camaraderie, philia. Philia was paramount in ancient Greek society. Relationships between men, whether in the military, in politics, or in intellectual circles, were often seen as the most significant and profound forms of connection. This intense male bonding, often taking precedence over marital relationships, which were viewed as primarily for procreation and household management, shaped the entire social landscape. Men built their careers, their reputations, and their closest friendships within these male-dominated public spheres, leaving women largely on the periphery. This pervasive male gaze meant that women, when they were present in public at all, primarily during religious festivals, were often objectified or viewed primarily for their physical appearance and modesty. They were not seen as intellectual equals or as active participants in civic life. Their role was to be seen briefly, to be modest, and to return to their homes, ensuring their honor and their family's reputation remained unblemished. This constant scrutiny, this awareness of being perpetually judged by male eyes, added another layer of psychological pressure to a woman's already confined existence. It truly sucked to be seen as a pretty object, not a thinking person. The political life of Athens was exclusively male. The assembly ecclesia, the council of 500 bull, and the juries were all composed solely of adult male citizens. The most important decisions regarding war, peace, law, and justice were made in these male-only spaces. Your husband, your father, your sons would participate in these vital civic functions while your voice remained utterly absent. You had no political rights, no say in the laws that governed your life, and no influence over the fate of your city-state. This complete political exclusion was a profound denial of your agency and intellect. Even religious festivals, while offering women some opportunities for public participation, were often structured around male priesthoods and public processions that highlighted male civic roles, while women played crucial roles in specific cults dedicated to goddesses like Athena or Demeter. Their public presence was often circumscribed by ritual and expected modesty, not true social freedom. Their religious duties were often extensions of their domestic roles, focused on the well-being of the oikos. One common misconception is that all Greek city-states treated women the same, while Athenian citizen women experienced significant confinement. Women in other Greek city-states, most famously Sparta, had significantly more physical freedom, participated in public athletic training often in the nude for unmarried women, and could even own and inherit land. However, even in Sparta, women had no political rights, and their primary role was to produce strong warriors for the state. The Athenian model, emphasizing domestic confinement, was particularly restrictive. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts, Iajou, Lysias's speeches which discuss women's roles, philosophical discussions, Iaggi, Aristotle's Politics on the Oikos, and archaeological findings of household layouts, Iaggi. The gyneconitis to understand the precise daily lives and restrictions faced by Athenian women, confirming their profound domestic confinement and political silence, but also highlighting regional differences. Furthermore, the lack of public interaction between unmarried men and women meant that any opportunity for mutual attraction, personal connection, or dating before marriage was virtually non-existent. Young men would spend their time in the agora, the gymnasium, or at symposia, where respectable women were typically excluded. Young women were confined to their homes. This extreme social segregation ensured that romantic relationships, as we know them, simply couldn't develop organically in the way they do today, further emphasizing the arranged and often passionless nature of marriage. The only opportunities for interaction might be fleeting glimpses at a religious festival, always under strict chaperonage, leaving no room for genuine courtship. The psychological toll of living in a society that loudly proclaimed freedom and equality for its male citizens, whilst systematically denying you any part in it, would be immense. You would constantly be reminded of your inferior status, your lack of agency, and your inability to shape your own political or social destiny. Your grievances, your opinions, your very voice were deemed irrelevant in the public sphere. This silent, pervasive exclusion, this constant suppression of your individuality was a profound and constant source of misery, making the celebrated Athenian democracy a truly terrible system for you. A female citizen, your potential, your intelligence, your desires, all were locked away behind the men's gaze and the walls of your home. The very concept of a companionate marriage based on intellectual or emotional intimacy was rare. Men sought intellectual companionship from other men in the gymnasium or symposia, and sexual gratification from hetairai or slaves. Wives were primarily seen as managers of the household and producers of legitimate male heirs. This fundamental division of roles meant that even within marriage, a woman often found herself profoundly isolated from her husband's intellectual and social world, further reinforcing her loneliness and lack of full partnership. So, your life as an Athenian woman in ancient Greece was profoundly shaped by gender segregation and the male gaze that dominated public life. Your world was largely confined by women's walls, dictating political silence and domestic confinement. Your primary role was in the household, raising children and managing slaves, with no voice in the public sphere, no legal autonomy, and limited education beyond domestic skills. This pervasive exclusion, ensuring your separation from public life and your political silence, was a defining, profoundly terrible aspect of Greek democracy, and a primary reason why dating, as you might envision it, simply didn't exist for you, even as you, the Athenian woman, were confined by the walls of your oikos and your voice silenced in the political sphere, and as slaves toiled beneath the democratic surface. The very institution of marriage in ancient Greece presented a bleak reality. Forget romantic love or personal choice. Your union was primarily a marriage market, a transaction of property, alliance, and dowry, making dating, as you know it, profoundly sucked. Imagine your future, laid out before you, not by your heart, but by the meticulous calculations of your male guardian, typically your father or closest male relative. For a young Athenian woman, marriage was the singular, ultimate goal of your life, the only path to a respectable existence, social legitimacy, and motherhood. Your identity was almost entirely defined by your future husband and his household. This wasn't a choice, it was a societal imperative. And your value in this market was coldly assessed. It truly sucked to be born a human commodity. The concept of a marriage market was pervasive. Marriages were almost universally arranged, meticulously negotiated between the prospective groom's guardian, usually his father, and your guardian. These negotiations would take place in the male sphere, often in the andron male reception room of your home, or perhaps at a symposium male drinking party, far from your ears. You would have no say in the choice of your husband. Your role was passive, to accept the match deemed suitable by your male relatives. The man chosen for you would likely be a stranger, often significantly older than you by 10 to 20 years or more. As men typically married in their late 20s or 30s, after completing their military service and establishing their careers, imagine your entire future, your entire intimate life, being decided by a committee of older men without your input, your desires, or your preferences. It truly sucked to be married off to a stranger you might have nothing in common with. The central component of this transaction was the dowry proix. Proi. This wasn't merely a gift, it was a substantial financial contribution from your family to the marriage, representing your family's financial standing and your economic value to your husband's household. The dowry could consist of large sums of silver coins, goods valuable property, such as textiles, jewelry, furniture, or even slaves, land. Although women couldn't directly own land in Athens, dowries could be presented as income from a specific piece of property. Your dowry was crucial for several reasons. Securing a good match. A larger, more substantial dowry could secure a more advantageous marriage for you, perhaps to a wealthier or more socially prominent family? Conversely, a small or non-existent dowry could severely limit your prospects, condemning you to a less desirable match or even a life without marriage, a socially precarious situation for a woman. Financial security. While the dowry was managed by your husband, it technically remained your property, or rather, your financial entitlement within the marriage. In theory, it was meant to provide for your financial security in case of divorce or widowhood, ensuring you would not become destitute. However, this protection was often imperfect, and reclaiming a dowry could be difficult. Demonstrating status. The size and quality of your dowry reflected your family's wealth and social standing. A public display of their prosperity and commitment to your future? Imagine the immense pressure on your father to provide a sufficient dowry, his family's honor, their economic stability, and your marriage prospects all hinged on his ability to assemble this financial package. Your worth in this market was often coldly quantified by the dowry you could bring, far more than by your personal qualities, your intelligence, or your character. You were, in essence, a human asset, transferred between households, with a price tag attached. It truly sucked to have your value be determined by your family's bank account. The purpose of marriage in ancient Greece was overwhelmingly procreation technopoeia, particularly the production of legitimate male heirs to carry on the family name, oikos, property, and ancestral cult. Emotional companionship and romantic love were considered entirely secondary or even irrelevant to this primary function. Indeed, the ancient Greeks often distinguished between different forms of love: eros, passionate, sexual desire, philia, friendship, affection, and agape, unconditional love. Marriage was often seen as primarily philia, a pragmatic partnership for managing the household and producing children, rather than a union driven by eros. This functional view of marriage starkly contrasted with any modern romantic notions, turning your most intimate relationship into a civic and familial duty. It really sucked to have sex for your city-state. The ceremony itself, the engesis, formal betrothal, and igdosis, handing over, highlighted this transactional nature. The engesis was a binding agreement made between the male guardians of the bride and groom, usually involving a handshake and an oath, often without the bride's presence. The igdosis was the act of the bride being formally handed over to her husband. Her consent, if given at all, was typically nominal, a ritualistic acceptance of a predetermined fate. This lack of personal agency in the very act of your marriage further underscored your status as property, a commodity being legally transferred between male guardians. One common misconception is that ancient Greek marriages were always devoid of any affection, while romantic love was not the basis for marriage, and the terms were deeply unequal. Some couples undoubtedly developed affection and companionship over time, particularly after children were born and they shared the responsibilities of managing the household. However, the foundational structure of these marriages arranged for pragmatic reasons, with significant age gaps and strict gender segregation, made genuine emotional intimacy a challenging achievement rather than a given expectation. The system was not designed to foster romance, but order. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts, e.g., those by Demosthenes or Lysias, concerning marriage, dowry, and divorce, philosophical discussions of geogygi, Xenophon's Economicus on household management, and social commentaries, e.g., by Isaias on inheritance, to understand the precise customs, expectations, and emotional realities of ancient Greek marriages, often finding a far more complex picture than simplistic notions of either universal misery or romantic partnership, but always within a rigid patriarchal framework Furthermore, the pressure on a bride to maintain her modesty and virtue was immense. Her reputation was inextricably linked to her dowry and her family's honor. Any perceived impropriety, any hint of unchastity before marriage could ruin her marriage prospects and bring shame upon her entire family. This constant scrutiny and the pervasive social pressure to remain pure in the eyes of society added another layer of anxiety to the already terrifying process of matchmaking. Your personal conduct was always under a magnifying glass, as it directly impacted your value in the marriage market. The very concept of a first date or a honeymoon was entirely absent. Your initial interactions with your husband would be formal, awkward, and likely intimidating. The pressure to immediately conceive and produce heirs would be immense. There was no gentle period of adjustment. You were immediately thrust into the full responsibilities of a wife and mistress of the household, often without any personal connection or emotional preparation for such a profound transition. Your personal development was sacrificed for immediate reproductive and managerial duties. The lack of options for unmarried women further underscored the nature of the marriage market. For a respectable Athenian woman, remaining unmarried was a social catastrophe, often condemning her to a life of dependence on male relatives, a burden, or, if without male kin, to destitution. This societal pressure to marry, regardless of personal feelings, meant that women had very little bargaining power in the marriage market, making them highly vulnerable to less desirable matches if their dowry was small or their family lacked influence. Your only path to social acceptance was through this transactional union. The psychological toll of living in such a predetermined existence, where your romantic destiny was utterly prearranged, where your personal feelings were deemed irrelevant, and where your worth was quantified by property, would be immense. You would grow up knowing your future was not your own, perhaps longing for a connection that society forbade. The constant pressure to conform to societal expectations, to accept an arranged marriage to a stranger, and to fulfill your duty of procreation, would erode your spirit, leaving you with a profound sense of resignation and a chilling lack of personal agency in the most intimate aspects of your life. Your earliest lessons were about duty, not desire, and your life was a testament to that harsh reality. So, your experience during dating in ancient Greece was profoundly shaped by the marriage market. Your future was a transaction of a property, alliance, and dowry, meticulously arranged by male guardians, leaving no room for personal choice or true affection. This pervasive system, reducing you to a commodity and prioritizing procreation and social status over personal happiness, was a defining, profoundly sucked aspect of ancient Greek dating. Ensuring your path to marriage was a cold, pragmatic calculation, even as you, the young Athenian woman, were handed over as property in the rigid marriage market. Your new reality as a wife brought a different, pervasive kind of misery. The husband, forget a loving partner or an equal companion, you would likely marry a much older man, often a stranger, whose true affections might lie elsewhere, making your marital life profoundly sucked. Imagine your new husband, as was common in ancient Greece, especially in Athens. Men typically married much later than women. While you might be just 14 to 18 years old or even younger, your husband would likely be in his late 20s, 30s, or even older, having completed his military training, established his career, and perhaps inherited his family's property. This significant age gap, often 10 to 20 years or more, created an inherent power imbalance rooted in vastly different life experiences, maturity levels, and social roles. Imagine being a teenager, suddenly married to a sophisticated, worldly man who was effectively your father's age. It truly sucked to marry an old man. This age disparity meant that your marriage was often devoid of genuine emotional intimacy or shared interests. Your husband, a full participant in the male-dominated public sphere, the agora, the assembly, the gymnasium, the symposia, male drinking parties, as explored in Chapter 3, had a vibrant social and intellectual life that largely excluded you. His closest companions would be other men. His intellectual discussions would occur at symposia, and his social bonds would be forged in public spaces. Your world, confined to the oikos household, would remain largely separate from his, leaving you profoundly isolated within your own marriage. It really sucked to be emotionally isolated in your own home. Your husband's affections, so if they existed at all, were rarely exclusive in ancient Athens, while monogamy was the norm for legal marriage. Extramarital relations for men were widely tolerated and even expected. Your husband would likely have hetairai, highly educated, sophisticated courtesans who we will discuss in Chapter 6 who offered intellectual companionship, witty conversation, and sexual services. These women frequented the symposia and were often the primary source of intellectual and emotional stimulation for Athenian men outside their wives. Your husband might spend considerable time and money with a hetera seeking the very companionship you, as his wife, were culturally forbidden from providing. Imagine your husband spending his evenings with a witty, charming woman, while you remained confined at home. It truly sucked to compete with intellectuals. Slaves. Sexual relations with household slaves were common and entirely legal for Athenian men. Your husband might have numerous enslaved women in your very household, with whom he could engage in sexual activity at will. Children born from these unions would technically be illegitimate, but the widespread practice was a constant reminder of your husband's sexual freedom and your own lack of control over his desires or his body. Imagine living in a household where your husband regularly slept with the women who served you, a constant, humiliating presence. It truly sucked to be cheated on by default. This polygamous in practice, if not legally reality, meant that your husband's true affections, his deepest emotional connections, and his sexual desires might lie entirely outside your marital bond. Your primary value to him was often your ability to manage the household efficiently and, most crucially, to produce legitimate male heirs as explored in Chapter 4 to carry on his lineage. Emotional companionship and romantic love were secondary or even irrelevant. To this primary function, your physical needs, your emotional desires, were often unacknowledged or unmet. The lack of a voice in your marriage contributed to your misery. Your husband, as the head of the oikos, held ultimate authority over you and all members of the household. His word was law. You were expected to be obedient, deferential, and to manage the domestic sphere without question. Any attempt to assert your independence, to express dissent, or to challenge his decisions could be met with displeasure, disdain, or even physical violence. As domestic abuse was largely tolerated and not legally prohibited, you had little recourse for unhappiness or mistreatment. It truly sucked to have no say in your own marriage. Your husband's physical presence might also be limited. He would spend much of his day in public spaces, the agora, the assembly, the gymnasium, and his evenings at symposia or with hetairai, while he would return to the oikos for meals and sleep. His active engagement with you might be minimal, reducing him to a distant, authoritative figure rather than a close companion. You would primarily interact with his household slaves, your children, and perhaps other female relatives, reinforcing your isolation within your own home. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek marriages were characterized by complete spousal indifference or hatred. While they were certainly arranged for pragmatic reasons and often lacked modern romantic love, some couples undoubtedly developed affection, respect, and companionship over time, particularly after children were born and they shared the responsibilities of managing the oikos. However, the societal structure, with its emphasis on gender segregation, male public life, and male extramarital relations, inherently limited the potential for emotional intimacy and equality within marriage. The experience of love within marriage was more about developing a pragmatic partnership than a passionate union. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts, gaiji, those concerning marriage, property, divorce, philosophical discussions, tsaiji, Xenophon's O Economicus on household management and marital roles, and comedic plays which often satirize marital dynamics to understand the precise customs, expectations, and emotional realities of ancient Greek marriages, consistently finding a structured, often unequal, relationship rather than a primarily romantic one. Furthermore, the very concept of divorce for a woman was incredibly difficult and carried immense social stigma. While a man could easily divorce his wife, often by simply sending her back to her father, a woman could rarely initiate divorce herself without her male guardian's permission, and often faced immense social and financial repercussions. This lack of agency in ending an unhappy or abusive marriage meant you were effectively trapped, condemned to endure your husband's affections, or lack thereof, for a lifetime. The psychological toll of marrying a stranger, often much older, whose affections might lie elsewhere, and with whom you had little shared intellectual or social life, would be immense. You would grapple with profound loneliness, emotional unfulfillment, and perhaps a deep sense of unacknowledged desires. The constant awareness of your husband's extramarital relations, often with slaves in your own household, would be humiliating and emotionally painful. This profound lack of agency over your emotional and sexual life, combined with the rigidity of your domestic role, would erode your spirit, leaving you in a state of quiet resignation, making your existence profoundly unhappy. Your dreams of love were systematically crushed by societal norms. The purpose of your existence, as defined by your husband and society, was primarily reproductive. Your body was a vessel for legitimate male heirs. This reduction of your personal identity to your reproductive capacity contributed to a profound sense of dehumanization, making your private life a matter of civic and familial concern, constantly evaluated for its success in extending his lineage. Your value was tied to your fertility, not your personality or desires. So, your marital life in ancient Greece was profoundly sucked because your husband was often an older stranger whose true affections lay elsewhere, and with whom you had little emotional intimacy. This reality of marrying for status and procreation within a patriarchal society that tolerated male extramarital relations ensured your marriage was a union of convenience rather than companionship. This profound lack of emotional fulfillment, making your most intimate relationship a source of continuous loneliness and objectification, was a defining aspect of what dating was really like for a woman in ancient Greece. Even as you, the Athenian wife, struggled with the emotional void of your arranged marriage and the often absent affections of your husband, the male citizens of ancient Greece enjoyed a very different kind of female companionship. Forget respectable wives. Your husband's true intellectual and social intimacy was often sought from the hetera, women who offered intellect, freedom, and a vibrant social presence, but lived under a profound social stigma, making their lives complex and often sucked. Imagine you are a hetaira. Hetaira, the word literally means companion, but it referred to a distinct class of highly educated, independent, and sophisticated courtesans in ancient Greece. Unlike respectable citizen wives who were confined to the oikos household and whose roles were strictly domestic as discussed in Chapter 2, heterae lived in the male public sphere. They were often medics, foreign residents, or freedwomen, meaning they were not bound by the same social rules as citizen women, granting them a unique, albeit precarious, form of freedom. It truly sucked to be free, but socially despised. Hetairai were renowned for their intellectual prowess, witty conversation, and artistic talents. They were trained not just in music, dance, and poetry, but often in rhetoric, philosophy, and politics. They were the primary female companions at symposion, the male drinking parties as explored in Chapter 3, where respectable wives were excluded. Here, heterae would engage in lively philosophical debates, recite poetry, play musical instruments, and offer stimulating conversation, providing the intellectual and emotional companionship that many Athenian men sought outside their often younger, less educated wives. Imagine captivating brilliant philosophers with your wit, knowing you couldn't be their wife. It truly sucked to be the smartest woman in the room, but still seen as a companion. Their freedom and independence were paradoxical. Unlike citizen women, heterae could move freely in public. They frequented the agora, attended public festivals, and participated in social gatherings, often without chaperones, owned property, and conduct business. Many heterae were financially independent, owning their own homes, businesses, and even slaves. They managed their own finances, a level of autonomy denied to citizen women. Choose their companions. They could choose their clients and their lovers, forming relationships based on mutual interest rather than family arrangement. This unique freedom, however, came at a profound social stigma. Despite their education, wealth, and influence, heterae were never considered respectable women in Athenian society. They were fundamentally outside the institution of marriage and the oikos, which were central to a woman's honor. Their relationships, though often long-lasting and affectionate, were not legally recognized marriages. Their children were illegitimate and did not hold citizen rights. Imagine being lauded for your intelligence and beauty, but constantly reviled for your profession. Always on the fringes of polite society, it truly sucked to be admired by men, but shunned by their wives. The life of a hetaira was often a dangerous gamble. Their income was dependent on their popularity and their ability to attract wealthy clients. Their financial security was always precarious, subject to changing tastes, political upheavals, or the decline of their own youth and beauty. They were also vulnerable to exploitation, harassment, and violence, particularly from less scrupulous clients or jealous citizen men, with little legal recourse. Imagine relying on your charm and intellect to pay the bills, knowing your career could end overnight. It truly sucked to have your livelihood tied to your looks. Famous hetairai like Aspasia of Miletus ha-Siu 470 to 400 BCE, who was the partner of the great Athenian statesman Pericles, famously influenced Athenian intellectual and political life, often drawing philosophers like Socrates to her salon. She was renowned for her rhetorical skills and intellectual prowess, demonstrating the immense influence a hetaira could wield. However, despite her close relationship with Pericles, she could not legally marry him as he had a law passed restricting citizenship to those born of Athenian parents and often faced public accusations of immorality and manipulating him. Her life highlights the paradoxical nature of hetairai, immense influence, and intellectual freedom. Coupled with profound social ostracism, This common historical fact of Aspasia's life provides a poignant example of the complex realities for heterae. The relationships with citizen wives were often fraught. While some husbands might discreetly visit heterae, the wives were expected to remain ignorant or tolerate these arrangements. However, open favoritism towards a hetera or bringing her into public view could lead to social scandal and conflict within the household. The very existence of heterae as intellectual and social companions highlighted the severe limitations placed on citizen wives, creating an unspoken tension in the societal structure. It really sucked to be the reason for marital discord. The long-term prospects for hetera were often bleak as they aged and their beauty faded. Their income and their clientele would inevitably decline. Without a legally recognized family or legitimate children, they might face destitution in old age, relying on the patronage of former clients or the charity of religious institutions. Their independence, so hard-won in youth, could prove fragile in later years. The psychological toll of living such a paradoxical life would be immense. You would constantly battle the pervasive social stigma, the unspoken contempt from respectable society. Even as you captivated its most powerful men, you would live with the knowledge that your relationships, however genuine, lacked legal legitimacy, and your children would be considered illegitimate. This constant tension between your vibrant public life and your marginalized social standing would lead to profound feelings of alienation, resentment, or a deep sense of unfulfilled longing for a normal life. Your freedom came at the cost of genuine social acceptance. The intellectual freedom offered to heterae was also a double-edged sword. While it allowed them to engage in stimulating discussions and cultivate their minds, it also underscored the profound intellectual void in their personal relationships, with men who sought their company for conversation but would never marry them for it. Their minds might be brilliant, but their hearts were often lonely, navigating relationships that were always transactional on some level. So, your experience during dating in ancient Greece was complicated by the presence of the hetera. These highly educated, independent courtesans offered Athenian men intellectual companionship and social freedom beyond their wives, but lived under a profound social stigma. This paradoxical existence, providing emotional and intellectual intimacy while facing societal condemnation and a precarious future, was a defining, profoundly sucked aspect of ancient Greek dating, highlighting the stark gender divides and the complex nature of relationships in Athens. Even as your husband found intellectual companionship with heterae or sought sexual gratification with slaves, the male citizens of ancient Greece, particularly in Sparta, a stark contrast to Athens, engaged in a different, often perplexing, form of relationship that might loosely be categorized as dating pederasty. Forget modern notions of romantic equality. This was an accepted, yet often complex, practice of older men forming relationships with younger boys, intertwined with mentorship and desire, making dating as you know it profoundly sucked. Imagine yourself as a young Spartan boy, perhaps in the Agog, the brutal state-sponsored training system, or as a young Athenian male undergoing your military training ephibeia or participating in gymnasium exercises. In ancient Greek society, particularly among the aristocracy and in certain city-states like Sparta, relationships between older men, the erasts, or lover, and younger adolescent boys, the eromenas, or beloved, were a well-documented and socially accepted, albeit often debated, phenomenon. This wasn't necessarily about romantic love as we define it today, but a complex blend of mentorship, social bonding, and often sexual desire. It truly sucked to have your mentorship be so confusing. The primary purpose of pederastic relationships, particularly in warrior societies like Sparta or in Athenian aristocratic circles, was often pedagogical and militaristic. The arrests. Usually a respected, experienced adult male citizen, often a warrior or a politician, would act as a mentor to the Eromenos, a younger boy typically in his teens, before he grew a beard. This mentorship involved instilling virtues. The older man would teach the boy courage, honor, discipline, wisdom, and civic responsibility, guiding him in his education and training. The relationship was seen as a way to transmit knowledge and values from one generation to the next, preparing the boy for his future role as a citizen and warrior, military bonding. In some city-states like Thebes, famously with its sacred band, pederastic relationships were believed to foster stronger bonds and greater courage on the battlefield. A warrior would fight more fiercely to impress his beloved or to protect him, thus strengthening the cohesion of the fighting unit. Socialization for young boys. It was a crucial part of their socialization into adult male society, providing a structured relationship with an older, experienced male who could guide them through the complexities of public life. However, many pederastic relationships also involved a sexual component. The ancient Greeks generally viewed pederasty as distinct from heterosexual marriage, which was for procreation and managing the oikos, and from relationships with heterae for pleasure and intellectual companionship. The sexual aspect of pederasty was often debated by philosophers with some, like Plato in his Symposium or Phaedrus, suggesting it should ideally be purely platonic and intellectual, while others focused on its physical aspects. The acceptable form of sexual engagement often involved the erasts taking an active, penetrative role, while the eromenos was typically expected to submit, but not derive pleasure. In order to maintain his honor as a passive role in later adulthood could be seen as shameful. This created a complex and often morally ambiguous dynamic. It really sucked to have your relationships be so unbalanced. The acceptance of pederasty varied significantly across Greek city-states and social classes. It was most prominent among the aristocracy and in certain military cultures like Sparta or Crete, where male bonding and the transmission of martial values were paramount. In Athens, it was generally accepted, but often debated, and there were legal prohibitions against exploiting boys for prostitution. However, the specific nuances of what was considered acceptable, ethical, or honorable within pederastic relationships were constantly discussed and sometimes challenged. Reflecting a complex and evolving social norm, the age difference was crucial. Pederastic relationships typically ended when the Eromenos grew a beard and transitioned into full adulthood, at which point he was expected to marry a woman and enter heterosexual relationships for procreation. The former Eromenos might then become an Erastes himself, perpetuating the cycle. This meant that pederasty was primarily a phase of male life, an initiation into adulthood, rather than a lifelong sexual orientation as understood today. It truly sucked to be seen as a phase. The psychological impact on the younger boy Eromenos could be complex. While theoretically benefiting from mentorship and social advancement, he was also subjected to the sexual desires of an older man within a relationship that was inherently asymmetrical in power. He was expected to submit, and his own desires or discomfort might be suppressed in the name of honor, mentorship, or social acceptance. This could lead to profound emotional and psychological burdens, particularly if the relationship was exploitative or abusive. The lines between affection, mentorship, and exploitation could be dangerously blurred. making genuine emotional well-being precarious. One common misconception is that pederasty in ancient Greece was identical to modern pedophilia. It is crucial to distinguish between them. Ancient pederasty, while involving adult-adolescent sexual relationships, was a culturally defined institution with specific social norms, often involving a mentorship aspect and a general expectation of the eromenos eventually entering heterosexual marriage. It was fundamentally different from the predatory, illegal, and universally condemned crime of child sexual abuse today, which targets prepubescent children and involves coercion. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek philosophical texts like Plato's Symposium or Xenophon's Symposium, which discuss the ideal forms of pederasty, legal codes which detail prohibitions against the exploitation of boys, and archaeological evidence, e.e. Jaji, vase paintings depicting pederastic scenes to understand the precise social function, ethical debates, and varying practices of pederasty across different Greek city-states and historical periods. Furthermore, the public scrutiny of such relationships, particularly in prominent families or military contexts, added another layer of pressure. While accepted, the behavior of the Erasts and Eromenos was still judged, an older man who failed to properly mentor his beloved, or who engaged in overly aggressive or inappropriate public displays of affection, could face social censure. This societal monitoring, however subtle, reinforced the specific norms and expectations surrounding these relationships. The absence of a male-female dating system, as we understand it in ancient Greece, meant that pederasty, for men, was often the primary arena for emotional and intellectual intimacy outside of marriage, while marriage was for procreation. Men sought companionship, intellectual stimulation, and deep emotional bonds with other men in the gymnasium or symposium. This meant that your deepest emotional and intellectual connections as a male citizen might be found in these relationships, rather than with your wife, highlighting the profound gender segregation of social life. The psychological toll of navigating these complex, often ambiguous, relationships would be immense for both Erastes and Eromenos. For the older man, the pressure to be a wise mentor, to uphold honor, and to control his desires within social norms. For the younger boy, the pressure to conform, to submit, and to learn lessons that involved physical intimacy, often without his full understanding or consent. This pervasive complexity, this constant negotiation of desire, mentorship, and social expectation, made these relationships a profound source of both connection and profound stress. The love of the Greeks was often deeply complicated and far from serene. So, your experience during dating in ancient Greece was shaped by the complex reality of pederasty, where older men formed relationships with younger boys, intertwined with mentorship and often sexual desire. This accepted, yet often morally ambiguous practice, reflecting a profound gender segregation and a different understanding of male bonds, was a defining, since profoundly sucked aspect of ancient Greek dating, highlighting the complex and often disturbing nature of relationships in the ancient world, even as you navigated the complex social landscape of pederasty and the rigid confines of the oikos. Your very entry into marriage as an ancient Greek was a public spectacle, not a romantic ideal. Forget personal vows or intimate celebrations. The wedding itself was a public performance, not a romantic rite, often emotionally cold and deeply rooted in societal expectations, making your dating experience profoundly sucked. Imagine the days leading up to your wedding. Whether you were the bride or the groom, this wasn't a time for quiet anticipation of a romantic union. Instead, It was a period of meticulous preparation for a series of formal rituals designed to publicly transfer the bride from her father's household to her husband's. Every step was governed by tradition, emphasizing property, lineage, and social contract over individual affection. The wedding was a civic act, not a personal one. It truly sucked to have your wedding be a legal formality. For the bride, the emotional reality was often stark. You would typically be between 14 and 18 years old, marrying a man often 10, 20 years your senior, whom you likely barely knew. The engesis, formal betrothal, the most legally binding part of the marriage process, would have occurred earlier, often without your presence. This was an agreement between your male guardian father or closest male relative and your prospective husband, where your dowry was discussed and formally promised. Your consent, if given at all, was typically nominal, a ritualistic acceptance of a predetermined fate. Imagine being a young girl, having your entire future decided by men, and then being told that this stranger was your husband. It truly sucked to be a human contract. The wedding ceremony, Gamos itself was a multi-day affair, primarily focused on rituals of transfer and integration rather than romance. Proalia, prenuptial rites. This involved rituals at the bride's home, including offerings to various deities like Artemis and Hera to prepare the bride for marriage and ensure fertility. The bride would often make sacrifices, dedicate her childhood toys, and symbolically cut her hair, marking her transition from maiden to wife. This was a farewell to her old life, often a somber occasion, signifying the end of her youth and independence. Gamos, the wedding day. The main event. The bride would bathe, often in sacred water, and be adorned in fine white robes. A veil and jewelry. The veil was crucial, often covering her face until she arrived at her new home, emphasizing her purity and new identity. The procession. This was the most public and visually striking part of the wedding. The bride would be formally transferred from her father's house to her husband's. She would typically ride in a chariot or a decorated cart, accompanied by her new husband. Torches, musicians playing flutes, and a procession of family and friends chanting hymns. This was a loud, public declaration of the marriage, a visible transfer of property and status. Imagine being paraded through the streets, dressed elaborately, but feeling like a piece of property being moved from one owner to another, your inner feelings utterly irrelevant to the public display. It truly sucked to be paraded like property. The feast upon arrival at the groom's house. A wedding feast would be held, attended by family and close friends. This was a communal celebration, often with singing, dancing, and drinking. However, even here, the bride's participation might be limited by modesty, and the focus remained on the formal union of the families. The consummation? The public aspect of the wedding would culminate with the bride being formally led to the bridal chamber thalamos by her husband and perhaps male friends. Songs might be sung outside the chamber to encourage fertility. This consummation was crucial for legalizing the marriage and ensuring the production of legitimate heirs, making it a functional act rather than a purely intimate one in some accounts. The wedding night was seen as less about romance and more about fulfilling a civic and familial duty. The emotional reality for the bride was often stark. She was marrying a stranger, often much older, and leaving everything familiar behind. Any anxiety, fear, or sadness she felt would be largely unspoken, subsumed by the demands of ritual and the pervasive public expectation of her modesty and obedience. Her private feelings were irrelevant to the success of this public performance. For the groom, while he had more agency in the selection process, the wedding was equally a formal rather than romantic affair. His focus was on securing a suitable dowry, a fertile wife, and a favorable alliance. The rituals were less about his personal affection and more about fulfilling his civic and familial duties as the head of a new oikos. His wedding night was about legitimizing an heir, not necessarily passionate intimacy, the lack of privacy surrounding the entire process, from the formal negotiations to the public procession and even the consummation with friends singing outside the bridal chamber, underscored the civic and public nature of marriage. It was a transaction witnessed and sanctioned by the community. Not a private union of two individuals, your most intimate moments were, to some extent, a public spectacle. One common misconception is that all ancient Greek weddings were grand, joyful celebrations while they involved feasting and public displays. The underlying legal and social functions often made them more about pragmatic alliance than romantic love. The emphasis on property, dowry, and procreation, and the arranged nature of marriages meant that the emotional warmth we associate with weddings today was often absent. The details of the rituals, designed for transfer of ownership and legal legitimacy, further highlight this functional aspect. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts, Demosthenes' speeches on marriage and family law, theatrical plays, comedies often satirize wedding customs, and archaeological evidence of wedding gifts and domestic rituals, from vase paintings and funerary monuments to understand the precise customs, expectations, and emotional realities of ancient Greek weddings, confirming their highly formalized and often economically driven nature. Furthermore, the very cost of the wedding itself was immense, often a significant financial burden on both families, particularly the brides due to the dowry. This economic weight further emphasized the transactional nature of the union, overshadowing any fleeting moments of personal joy. The display of wealth through lavish feast and elaborate clothing was a crucial part of the social performance. Adding to the financial strain, the social expectations placed upon the newlywed couple were immediate and immense. The wife was expected to manage the household efficiently and to produce children, particularly sons. Without delay, the husband was expected to maintain his public life, his civic duties, and to ensure the prosperity of his oikos. There was no prolonged honeymoon period, the realities of married life, with its duties and responsibilities, began immediately after the ceremony. The psychological toll of participating in such an emotionally cold and publicly scrutinized event would be immense. For the bride, it was the culmination of a childhood devoid of personal choice, a profound moment of irreversible transition into an unknown future with a stranger. For both, it was the pressure to perform their roles flawlessly, to project an image of dignity and conformity. Even if their inner emotions were churning with anxiety or resignation, this constant performance, this suppression of true feelings, was a profound and lasting burden, ensuring that their marriage began not with romance, but with a cold, formal handshake. So, your experience during dating in ancient Greece culminated in the wedding, a public performance, not a romantic rite. This formal, often emotionally cold, ceremony marked your entry into a marriage driven by property, alliance, and the relentless pressure of procreation. This pervasive lack of personal intimacy, coupled with the rigid adherence to societal expectations, was a defining, profoundly sucked aspect of ancient Greek dating, ensuring that your path to marriage was a bleak and dutiful transaction, even as you navigated the emotionally cold rituals of your wedding and resigned yourself to a life dictated by social norms. Your primary purpose as an ancient Greek wife was relentlessly emphasized by your husband and by society procreation. Forget companionship or personal fulfillment, Your sole purpose was to produce male heirs, transforming your marriage into a demanding duty, not a partnership. Making your dating experience profoundly suck. Imagine the immense, unspoken pressure that settled upon you from the very moment you were handed over to your husband. Your ultimate value, your very purpose within the oikos household and in Athenian society, hinged on your ability to bear children, specifically legitimate male heirs. Sons were crucial for carrying on the family name oikos. The continuation of the male lineage was paramount, ensuring the family's identity and legacy persisted through generations. Inheriting property. Only legitimate male heirs could inherit property, ensuring the family's wealth and status were maintained. Performing ancestral rites. Sons were responsible for performing sacred rituals to honor deceased ancestors, a vital duty to ensure the family's spiritual well-being in the afterlife. Providing new citizens for the polis for the city-state. Male heirs represented future citizens, soldiers, and participants in the democratic process. This relentless dynastic burden weighed heavily on your shoulders. Your fertility was not a private matter. It was a matter of civic and familial concern, meticulously observed and discussed every month, every cycle, would bring renewed anxiety. The household would scrutinize your health, your appetite, and any fleeting symptoms, fueling hope or despair. Imagine your pregnancy not as a personal miracle, but as a public test of your biological efficacy, constantly under scrutiny by your husband, his family, and the broader community. It truly sucked to be a human breeding machine. The expectation was not just to have children, but to have many children. Given the incredibly high rates of infant and child mortality in ancient Greece, as explored in How Horrifyingly Short Your Life Was in the Viking Age. Chapter 1. A similar reality existed in Greece. Women were expected to have numerous pregnancies throughout their fertile years to ensure that at least a few sons survived to adulthood. You might endure multiple agonizing labors, only to watch your precious children succumb to disease in infancy, forcing you to conceive again and again, enduring repeated cycles of hope, pain, and a heartbreaking loss. Your body was a vessel, perpetually engaged in the arduous process of procreation and recovery. It really sucked to grieve constantly, and then do it all again. If you gave birth to a daughter, while she would be loved and raised, the pressure to produce a son would not diminish. It would only intensify. A daughter, however beloved, could not carry on the family name or perform ancestral rites. You would immediately be expected to try again, continuing the grueling cycle of conception, gestation, and agonizing labor until a male heir was secured. Your personal value hinged on the gender of your offspring. It truly sucked to be judged by your child's gender. The ultimate nightmare was barrenness stera. Stera if you failed to produce any children, especially sons. Your position as a wife could become incredibly precarious. While outright divorce for a man to send his wife back to her father was possible, it carried social and financial implications. However, a barren wife might be publicly scorned, emotionally neglected, or even face the prospect of her husband taking a second wife, though illegal for citizen men. Concubinage or hetairai relations were common, or adopting a son to ensure his lineage continued. Your entire purpose as a wife, your family's investment in your dowry, could be rendered futile by a biological reality beyond your control. This profound personal failure would lead to immense shame and despair. This relentless pressure transformed your marriage from any semblance of a partnership into a demanding duty. Your body became an instrument for dynastic continuity, constantly evaluated for its reproductive success. Any personal desires, any emotional needs were secondary to this biological imperative. Your sexual intimacy with your husband, while potentially affectionate, was primarily a means to an end procreation. This reduction of your personal identity to your reproductive capacity contributed to a profound sense of dehumanization within your most intimate relationship. The lack of effective contraception or family planning methods further exacerbated this burden. Ancient remedies for birth control were rudimentary, unreliable, and often dangerous. This meant that women were often perpetually pregnant or recovering from pregnancy throughout their fertile years, placing immense cumulative strain on their bodies, accelerating their physical decay, and increasing their risk of death with each subsequent pregnancy. Your body was a factory, constantly producing, constantly breaking down, without respite. One common misconception is that ancient Greek marriages, while arranged, were always emotionally barren, while romance was not their primary basis, and procreation was paramount. Some couples undoubtedly developed affection and companionship over time, particularly after successful child rearing. However, the pervasive social structure, which emphasized gender segregation and the wife's primary reproductive role, fundamentally limited the scope for emotional equality or intellectual intimacy within marriage, especially when contrasted with the male experience of companionship through symposia and hetaerai. The oikos was a unit of production and reproduction, first and foremost. Historians still meticulously study ancient Greek legal texts concerning marriage, divorce, and property, which highlight the wife's role in producing heirs. Philosophical discussions, Aristotle's Politics on the Oikos and Citizenship, and demographic data from skeletal remains, which often show signs of multiple pregnancies and birth trauma, to understand the precise expectations and realities of procreation in ancient Greek marriages, consistently revealing its central, demanding, and often perilous role for women. Furthermore, the communal scrutiny of your reproductive success added immense psychological pressure. Your husband's family, his friends, and the wider community would be keenly aware of your pregnancies, your births, and the health of your children. Any delay in conception, or the loss of a child, would be a subject of quiet discussion or even open concern, further amplifying your anxiety and sense of inadequacy. Your fertility was a public concern, not a private matter, ensuring that your most intimate struggles were constantly under observation and judgment. The grief of child loss, a common experience, was also inextricably linked to the pressure for procreation. You would endure the heartbreak of bearing multiple children, only to be expected and perhaps compelled to conceive again, transforming your deepest sorrows into a renewed push for dynastic continuity. This relentless cycle of hope, loss, and expectation would leave profound emotional scars, making your life a constant battle against grief and physical exhaustion. The lack of any real alternative for women solidified this burden for a respectable Athenian woman. Remaining unmarried or childless was a social catastrophe, often condemning her to a life of dependence or destitution. This societal imperative meant that, regardless of personal feelings, the relentless pursuit of procreation was an inescapable duty, ensuring that your life was consumed by this fundamental expectation. So, your marital life in ancient Greece was profoundly sucked because your very purpose was procreation. The relentless demand to produce male heirs, coupled with high infant mortality rates, the lack of family planning, and the terrifying consequences of barrenness, transformed your marriage into a demanding, often emotionally cold, duty. This profound emphasis on your reproductive capacity, reducing your personal identity to a means of dynastic continuity, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of ancient Greek dating, ensuring that your pursuit of marriage was ultimately a biological imperative, not a journey of personal fulfillment. You've endured having your romantic future rigidly arranged from childhood, been confined by the walls of your oikos and silenced in the political sphere, witnessed the exclusive male bonds and public life that excluded you, been transferred as property in the marriage market, lived with an older, often absent husband whose affections lay elsewhere, seen the complex world of heirs offering intellect and freedom at a social cost, confronted the nuances of pederasty as a form of male mentorship and desire, navigated the emotionally cold rituals of your public wedding, and finally, carried the immense burden of relentless procreation as your sole purpose, as the distant echoes of the ancient debates fade and the phantom scent of olive oil dissipates. A profound, lingering truth settles upon you. Dating and relationships in ancient Greece were not about personal fulfillment. They were a terrible system, rigidly controlled by social norms, leaving little room for individual choice or genuine romantic connection, and often dictated by duty and necessity. Consider the fundamental denial of personal choice and autonomy that defined your entire life, particularly as a woman. Your marriage, the most intimate and foundational relationship, was not a matter of personal affection, but a cold, pragmatic transaction arranged by male guardians for reasons of property, alliance, and lineage. You were a human commodity, transferred between households, with your personal feelings utterly irrelevant. This profound lack of agency, imposed from childhood, ensured that your emotional and romantic destiny was predetermined, a stark contrast to any modern notion of dating. It truly sucked to be a human asset. Then there's the pervasive gender segregation and profound isolation. As a respectable Athenian woman, your world was confined to the oikos, the household. You were systematically excluded from the vibrant male public sphere, the agora, the gymnasia, the symposia where men forged their closest bonds, debated philosophy, and built their careers. Your interactions with men outside your immediate family were severely limited and strictly chaperoned. This pervasive isolation, coupled with your husband's often absent affections and his engagement with hetairai or slaves, left you emotionally detached within your own marriage. You were surrounded by people, yet often profoundly alone. And what about the unyielding pressure for procreation? Your primary purpose as a wife was to bear children, specifically legitimate male heirs, to continue the family lineage and provide new citizens for the polis. This relentless biological imperative transformed your marriage into a duty, not a partnership. You endured numerous pregnancies, often facing the agonizing pain of unmedicated labor and the heartbreaking reality of high infant mortality, only to be expected to conceive again and again. Your body was a vessel, perpetually consumed by the demands of reproduction, making your most intimate relationship a source of continuous physical and emotional strain. It truly sucked to be a breeding machine for the city-state. Finally, the deep social inequality and hypocrisy. While male citizens enjoyed a unique form of direct democracy and the freedom to participate in public life, their leisure and political participation were built on the brutal, dehumanizing labor of a vast enslaved population. Women, though citizens, were politically silenced and legally subordinate, their lives confined to domesticity. Even men's non-marital dating, juji, pederasty with younger boys or relationships with hetairai often occurred within structures that, while accepted, were rooted in power imbalances or social stigma. The celebrated freedom of ancient Greece was a selective privilege, not a universal right, inherently built on pervasive exclusion and often exploitation. It truly sucked to live in a democracy where most people weren't free. The ultimate legacy of ancient Greek relationships, for all their philosophical discussions of love and beauty, is a complex one. While they pioneered concepts of civic participation for a select few, their approach to dating, marriage, and gender roles was deeply patriarchal and utilitarian, profoundly different from modern ideals. The emphasis on duty, lineage, and social order overshadowed individual happiness and romantic fulfillment, creating a system that, while functional for its time, was undeniably harsh for many. One particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the rhetorical advice given to Athenian men about choosing a wife versus a hetaira. Philosophers and social commentators would explicitly advise men to seek a wife for the purpose of producing legitimate children and providing a trustworthy guardian of the house. Oikonomike, while seeking hetairai for pleasure, intellectual companionship, and refined conversation. This stark division of female roles, enshrined in public discourse, perfectly encapsulates the functional, non-romantic nature of marriage for Athenian men and the limited expectations placed on wives beyond domestic and reproductive duties. This wasn't merely an observation, it was a societal prescription, reinforcing the emotional void within marriage. Historians still meticulously study such prescriptive texts, e.g. Demosthenes' speech against Neaera, Xenophon's Oeconomicus, or Aristotle's Politics to understand the precise societal expectations and the very limited scope for wives to fulfill roles beyond the purely domestic or reproductive. Confirming the pervasive, unequal gender roles in relationships. Ultimately, your experience of what dating was really like in ancient Greece was a profound and continuous ordeal. It was a life defined by the systematic denial of personal choice in love, enforced gender segregation, overwhelming pressure for procreation, and a constant awareness of your existence as a social and familial tool. This rigid, utilitarian approach to relationships, contrasting sharply with any modern romantic ideal, ensured that dating in ancient Greece was profoundly sucked, leaving a legacy of constrained desire and profound personal sacrifice. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant murmurs of ancient philosophers and the imagined confines of the oikos finally subside. You are safe in your own time, far removed from the brutal realities of ancient Greek relationships. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of personal autonomy, the warmth of genuine, chosen love, and the profound freedom to forge your own path to connection. A stark contrast to the sucky truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night and have sweet dreams.